We continue this series of Further Ramblings of Railwaymen with the second part of Pat Kinsella's exploits as a fireman at Guildford Motive Power Depot. His first story that he related to me is about the various types of trains that he worked in the steam days, this one being a circus train. The circus comes to town. Freight trains were well known in the steam age for transporting a huge variety of goods and livestock. Nothing was too large or small. Whole farms were at times taken by train from A to B. Bullion, coal, petrol, crude oil and aviation fuel. Ammunition trains and army vehicles. Pigeon specials. Royal mail, parcels, engineering trains and milk trains to name just some. But not well known was the movement of circuses by train. One such circus company, Bertram Mills, overwintered near Ascot, Berkshire. Ascot West was their winter quarters, and the siding on the downside half a mile west of Ascot Station had a platform to facilitate loading equipment and certain animals such as elephants. As a fireman, Pat worked a Bertram Mills circus train from Ascot West to Kingston via Twickenham with an M7 tank locomotive at the start of their seasonal tour circa 1960. He recalls looking back along the train en route and seeing a couple of elephant trunks sucking in the fresh breeze as they whizzed along. Two youngsters, having partly climbed a crossing gate, Oakmead crossing near Staines, to wave at their locomotive, had quite a surprise seeing a couple of elephant trunks passing just a couple of feet from their faces. The elephants disembarked in the goods yard at Kingston, before parading through the town, as was the custom in those days, to advertise the coming event. In recent years, Pat was in conversation with a retired railway booking clerk from Havant, the subject being circus trains. He related to Pat an amusing story about a circus advertising event which he believes took place in the 1950s. The circus was coming to town, and as usual, suitably attired circus hands were in town placing adverts in shop windows and pinning posters on lampposts, etc. To assist them in their endeavours and draw attention to their show, they employed the assistance of a chimpanzee. Of course, after walking through the town, the small parade arrived at a railway station and presented itself at the booking office window to seek permission to display some posters. As it was a fairly quiet time of day, Pat's acquaintance, the booking clerk, a friendly, trusting sort, invited them all into the office for a nice cup of tea. The chimp was very interested in the interior of the office, and so, as a special treat, they pulled a high stool up to the desk and sat him facing the open ticket window, ready and eager to issue whatever was required, from a 1-penny platform ticket to a first-class return to Edinburgh. It soon came to pass that an anticipating passenger appeared on the outside and paused to get out his wallet before looking into the office. As he raised his head to state his request, he was confronted by the sight of the chimpanzee scratching his armpit. The alarm on our passenger's face must have alerted the chimp, because he gave a great big welcoming smile, exposing well-spaced yellow teeth set in bright pink gums, before breaking into a repetitive chattering resembling yeah, 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 yeah. The chimp, that is, not the passenger. The would-be traveller, a rather straight-laced individual, proceeded straight to the station master's office to lodge a complaint, who after careful consideration was obliged to reprimand the booking clerk on 2 counts. 1. Allowing non-authorised personnel into the booking office. 2. Allowing a chimpanzee to impersonate a member of staff, albeit out of uniform. Well, I suppose some people have a sense of humour and some don't. Good old boys. Like myself, Pat considers it a privilege to have known and acted as fireman to a great many older drivers and listened to their tales of what happened before, during and after both World Wars. It was not uncommon for some of these men to have started their career on the railway prior to the 1923 grouping of the railway companies into the Big Four. Indeed, some men spent 25 years or more on the shovel before obtaining their driver's appointment. Some worked throughout 2 world wars and experienced several industrial disputes, including the 1926 general strike, experiences which at times could have put their employment and homes in jeopardy. When the First World War broke out, young men responded to the call of Lord Kitchener's poster campaign, "Your country needs you," and joined up for the military. The recruitment was such a success that essential services such as those provided by the Southern Railway were robbed of key staff, and as train crews and signallers were in increasingly short supply, it caused something of a crisis on the network. This mistake was not emulated in the Second World War, however. People working in essential services were classified as being in reserved occupations and only permitted to join the armed forces in exceptional circumstances. As a consequence, many railwaymen were mistakenly regarded as conscientious objectors and ended up being treated downright shabbily at times. Pat had heard stories of train crews, especially during the Dunkirk evacuation, working 20 or more hours at a stretch and being refused refreshment at some of the tea stalls that were provided for the troops returning from overseas. There were even instances of railwaymen being sent a white feather, which must have been deeply distressing for them and their families. In an effort to stop this unwarranted condemnation, some railway companies minted a badge to be worn by employees which indicated they were in railway service. All in all, these veteran railwaymen succeeded in doing a tremendous job and tolerated so much hardship, and Pat and I have only the utmost respect for them. They were our tutors, along with others, on the art of firemanship, and all were proud men in respective profession. Needless to say, by the time Pat started on the railway in 1957, many senior drivers were in their twilight years of service and closing in on retirement fast. Goodness knows what hardship they endured over the years and how those trials and tribulations moulded their characters. Some men managed to retain a boyish quality, whereas others developed a rather more serious attitude to their job. But on the whole, the majority were quiet and thoughtful, with a certain dignity about them. Well, that is until something went wrong, of course. And who could blame them for displaying, shall we say, a little indiscretion at times? One occasion springs to Pat's mind. Pat was booked as fireman to Fred Cole and were rostered to work a special duty. This involved travelling as passengers to Nine Elms, preparing a locomotive before going light engine to Waterloo, and working a boat train to Southampton Old Docks. Fred and Pat turned up for duty well turned out in clean overalls and serge jackets, although Fred being Fred, he had gone the extra mile with a collar and tie and highly polished shoes. Arriving at the Elms, they found their locomotive, rebuilt West Country Class 34018 Axminster, in splendid external condition, with both nameplates clean and polished, but the footplate was in a deplorable state due to it being her first duty off shed. They barely had an hour for preparation, so Fred dashed off to the stores for oil, and Pat set about the task of finding the tools, then made a start on preparing the fire and cleaning the boiler front and gauge glasses as best as he could. Fred returned with the oil, then filled up the feeder before standing it in the fire oil dish for a few minutes to warm it up, in effect making the liquid more fluid. Pat began cleaning the windows and spectacle glasses, and when the oil had reached sufficient elasticity, Fred went underneath to lubricate the inside motion. Had there been enough time, Pat would have offered to do this for him, but as it was getting even closer to their departure time, there were precious few minutes spare to do the job between them. As Fred climbed down into the heavily clinkered pit in his spotlessly clean shoes, his grim expression told Pat that it did not cheer him one bit. Yet he proceeded to lubricate the various parts until he reached the vicinity of the big end. Stretching up, he placed the feeder on the connecting rod, then levered himself into position to replenish the oil reservoir. Unfortunately, as he struggled up into that position, he knocked the feeder off its perch, and it jammed upside down between him and the connecting rod. Even worse, as there was no cap on the feeder, the hot oil spewed out all the way down Fred's freshly laundered bib and brace overalls, as though being pumped by an invisible force. Alarmed at the F expletives emanating from beneath their locomotive, Pat jumped down to find out what had happened. Poor Fred, unable to free himself in time, finished up with almost the entire contents of the oil feeder down his front before he managed to escape into the pit. But being the consummate professional, he replenished the container and returned to oiling the underneath, albeit in the foulest of moods, muttering profanities to himself. After all that, they managed to reach Waterloo in good time and set off for Southampton Old Docks with the Cunarder, to rendezvous with the RMS Queen Mary as scheduled, and, as it turned out, it was a memorable trip. Ironically, Fred's incident had assisted Pat on their journey because although he had to shovel more coal than usual, Axminster steamed better than ever, due to being worked harder as Fred got his own back on the locomotive. After Fred retired, he was for a time a locker attendant at the Guildford Lido. Pat inquired of him, would not the job be suitable for his old colleague George Boone? No, he replied, you've got to have the right temperament for this job. Pat thinks he was serious. Good old Fred. On loan duties. During the 50s and 60s, there was a desperate shortage of locomotive crews at most London depots and their satellite sub-depots. Consequently, depots with a crew to spare would often be booked on loan to cover other depots' work. It was not unusual for Guildford men to be booked duties in other depots such as Nine Elms and were allowed 2 hours travelling in each direction. Stewart's Lane, 2 hours, Feltham, 2 hours, Fratton, 1.5 hours, Basingstoke, 1.5 hours, and Reading Southern about 1.5 hours. All these hours were in addition to the length of the loco crew's diagram that the on-loan driver or fireman covered. Therefore, most on-loan duties usually meant a 12-hour day, or sometimes more if, for instance, the diagram meant finishing in the borrowing depot after the last train had gone. 14 hours or so was not unusual in such cases. Sometimes things could work in your favour though. On one of those occasions, Pat was booked on loan to Reading Southern. One was always a bit apprehensive because mostly you would have no idea who your driver was beforehand. If it was a driver that one had not worked with before, it was difficult to ascertain his method of driving. Was he heavy-handed or light-handed? This made a significant difference to firing techniques. Well, on this occasion there was no need to worry. Pat's driver was a local Reading man by the name of Bill Kirk, whose knowledge of routes over some of the Great Western lines was first class. He gave Pat some very good advice on what was required of him and the locomotive. Their duty entailed preparing a bullied Q1 class, Charlie by nickname, before turning her to go tender first light to Morton Cutting near Didcot, then doing a double trip back up to Reading West Yard with 2 freight trains. Working over Western metal was a novelty Pat enjoyed very much, especially as you were in no man's land, so to speak. On arrival in Morton Cutting, Pat and his driver were informed that both of their trains were already made up and ready to depart. If preferred, both of them could be coupled together to make just one trip of it. This entailed pulling forward and setting back onto the second half, making a total of 60 wagons in all, equal to 120. Pat's driver agreed, as it meant an early day, so off they set onto the up relief about mid-morning. Once the Charlie had got the train up to speed, the rest was fairly easy. The road from Didcot to Reading is exceptionally level, with hardly any deviation in the 160 feet average above sea level, which is why the water troughs were strategically situated near Goring. Everything was going very well, when to Pat's alarm, driver Kirk called out to Pat, gesturing towards his side of the loco. Look back, he cried. As Pat remembers, driver Kirk didn't have any front teeth and could appear quite startling at times. Thinking he meant for Pat to examine his side of the train, he looked back only to see the Red Dragon, headed by a castle class on the up main, gaining very fast, her train's nameboard proudly displayed on the smokebox door. What a sight she made as her fireman lowered the tender water scoop into the trough, displacing hundreds of gallons of water to left and right, some even going up into the tender, he believes. Travelling in excess of 70, she passed them in great style. A brief wave from the fireman and she was gone, the sound of a vacuum pump just audible above the roar of the chimney. Being a rookie fireman, Pat was staggered by the excitement of it all. This senior fireman saluting him, a fellow engineman. The speed, the noise, the whole experience left an impression on Pat to this day. Pat's driver must have seen the excitement on Pat's face when he turned around, because he grinned broadly, looking very pleased with himself. On arrival in Reading West Yard, they detached the train and ran light to the Southern Depot. A quick disposal, and Pat was on his way home, a couple of hours or so earlier than expected. In truth, Pat so enjoyed the trip, a repeat performance would have been most welcome. One of those days. Wednesday the 26th of December 1963, Boxing Day, a cold snap over the Christmas festivities culminated in a snowstorm over the southern counties of England, starting at 9 p.m. in the evening. Very unusually in our part of the country, heavy snow continued to fall until about 9 a.m. the following morning. It laid to more than 12 inches on open ground, but built up to 6 or 7 feet in drifts in some areas with the wind behind it. This was especially so on higher ground such as Haslemere. Temperatures then fell alarmingly and stayed freezing for several weeks. Enormous stalactite icicles developed under bridges and inside tunnels. A few, as under Church Lane East Bridge at Aldershot, grew to a length of 8 feet and about a foot wide at the top. These obstacles were very hazardous. English locomotives did not carry headlights, so engine crews were left in the dark, so to speak, and were best advised to keep their heads inside the cab when passing under bridges during the hours of darkness, and when passing through tunnels, some tunnels continually drip water all the year round. Following the initial snowfall, days and nights were occupied by trackmen clearing snow from points, rods, signal cables and pulleys. Calagas point heaters were installed at some key locations at that time, but the bottles were not always replenished, or the burners remained unlit, resulting in frozen points. Consequently, there was a massive delay in cancellations of trains during this difficult time. The railway in the Haslemere area was covered by deep frozen snow, especially in places where no lineman had trodden since the blizzard began. This remained the situation a couple of weeks or so into January, when Pat rotated to a week of early turn duties. His day started at 3 a.m, with a 3-mile walk to work for an early turn on a freezing cold January morning with 12 inches of snow on the ground. For the whole month of January 1963, there was no let-up with the big freeze. Pat's duty that day was to work the Guildford to Petersfield freight, which was running about 90 minutes late due to the weather conditions. His driver was Ted Fry, a quirky character who addressed everyone as old boy. Indeed, his eccentricity led to him being described as the gentleman of the old school. Well, Pat's not sure about that, but he does remember him being a cool customer under pressure. Their locomotive was a Q1 class, number 33022, and the train a full load equal to 60 wagons. Departing Guildford Yard, they struggled along, down for steam, no change there then, some of Pat's colleagues would say, but enough to take them up the 1 in 80 rising gradient to Haslemere's summit, 515 feet above sea level. As was the procedure at the time, they were signalled into platform 2, the up main to enable the shunter to uncouple the Haslemere wagons and run round via the down line and then run the wagons off into the down sidings, London end of the station. As they had a full load, Ted pulled down hard on the down starting signal to clear the guards van of the up loop at the London end of the station. Meanwhile, Pat busied himself with getting some steam back. The fire looked like a huge blob of cooling molten lava, and the small briquettes masquerading as coal did not help. After uncoupling the Haslemere's portion of the train, the shunter said "right" to Pat's driver, who thought it to mean that they had the signal to move forward, and as the signal was situated on the fireman's side of the locomotive, Ted was unaware that they were passing the signal at danger. Pat was equally to blame, as he should have been looking out. The error was realised when they didn't cross over to the down line, and to make matters worse, the detonator machine positioned beyond the starting signal to prevent such an error occurring hadn't been loaded. Stopping immediately, Ted instructed the shunter, who had joined them on the footplate, to go back and make sure we were clear of the up loop points, as he intended to set back onto their train because an up passenger train was due. On returning to the points, the shunter stumbled awkwardly in the deep snow, raising his arms upwards as he did so. Looking out from the cab, Ted took his flailing arms to be a hand signal, the tip to move, and began reversing back towards the rear of their train. Unfortunately, the rear coal wagon wasn't clear of the points, and as they had only just run through the points, which were set for the up loop, they derailed 4 wagons and cut through the 650-volt supply cable for the electric rail in the process. Pat saw a tremendous flash, and for one terrible moment he thought the shunter, who was standing so very close, had been electrocuted, but he was lucky. Fortunately, their locomotive was unaffected by the derailment, but both up and down lines, together with the up loop line, were now completely blocked. Ted then instructed Pat to proceed to the up home signal to put down detonator protection. On arrival, he was confronted with a 12-car London-bound commuter train at a standstill, having suffered a loss of power and the signal being automatically reversed to red. The driver was endeavouring to contact the signalman on the signal post telephone, but it was out of order. Returning to the loco, the inimitable Ted, cool as you like, decided that whilst they were waiting for instructions, they should have a nice can of tea, old boy. Pat struggled to the signal box and returned trudging through a foot of snow with their nice can of tea, which was very welcome. Shortly after, when the platform foreman paid them a visit, Pat inquired what was being done about the 12-car train standing at the home signal. "There's no train at the home signal," he shot back. "There is," Pat insisted. "No, that's the roof of the brake van in the up siding you're looking at." "No, it isn't," said Pat. "Oh, yes, it is," he countered. Pat said again, "It's not. There's a train on the home signal. He'd been down there to protect." As the realisation dawned that this twit of a fireman, who was probably the cause of this debacle in the first place, may just be right all along, a pained expression slowly spread across his face. "Sod it," was the departing exclamation. An hour later, Ted was issued with the Liphook signalman's yellow wrong-line order form D, permitting them to take their locomotive down onto the commuter train for the purpose of assisting it back wrong road to Liphook. Meanwhile, the catch points by the A287 road bridge had been plugged and clipped as per instruction for wrong line orders. However, as the locomotive was vacuum fitted only, the plan was to propel the stranded train back to Liphook whilst using handbrakes for stopping, as the 12-coach train consisted of 2-car bill and 2-car Hal stock, which had non-corridor connections between units. The train then, by now, was devoid of air, after standing for so long with no compressors or heating for the passengers. Passengers were made of sterner stuff in those days. As they neared the commuter train, Pat was descending the loco steps in preparation to couple up and saw the Fratton driver, together with his guard, waiting on the ground when something extraordinary happened. Their train started to move on its own. Later at the inquiry, there was some speculation as to whether or not they went straight onto their train without stopping short first, as per the rulebook, but Pat personally believes that it began to move before they even reached it, that the vibration of their loco was enough to start the movement on the falling gradient, even though the leading coach handbrake had definitely been applied. Gaining momentum down the 1 in 100 falling gradient towards Portsmouth, the crew and onlookers on the ground were unable to reach the train's second coach's handbrake, non-corridor stop remember, and the snow was up to their shins. As the runaway gathered speed quickly, a noble effort was made by the local station master, who, having reached the leading London end cab, found the handbrake already applied. He jumped down into the snow and ran alongside the runaway train towards the second cab, but the acceleration was such that their gallant hero failed to reach it, and he fell to his knees utterly exhausted. Ted stopped their locomotive to pick him up, and Pat offered him his seat. He climbed into the cab, gasping for air, and removed his station master's hat to wipe his brow. You might remember them, like a large black dinner plate with a handle. But as he slumped into Pat's seat, he gave his head a right crack on the hydrostatic lubricator. "Who put that bloody thing in such a bloody stupid place?" he complained. "Oliver bullied," Pat replied, thinking he would be impressed with his knowledge. "Imbecile," he bellowed. Pat didn't know if he meant Oliver bullied or him, but thought it imprudent to ask. A little further down the track, Pat spotted the train's guard, lying poleaxed on the bank wearing a snow-like shroud, his pipe emitting smoke like an advert from Sweet Errinmore tobacco. "Stop, stop," Pat cried to Ted. "There's the guard lying in the snow, freezing to death." "Leave him," ordered the senior manager. "We've got to catch that runaway." By now the train was out of sight and had passed Hammer Crossing. As they approached Hammer Crossing in pursuit, an observant trackman emerged from the crossing house, shouting and waving red flags in all directions. "Stop, stop, stop," he bellowed in high tenor. "A train has just gone down there." "We know that," said the senior manager, regaining some of his dignity. Following the runaway down the bank, they eventually caught up after it came to a stand in the dip prior to Liphook, just by the up advanced starter semaphore signal, 2 3/4 miles down the line from Haslemere. It was a lucky day for the railway, because Pat believes that had the commuters realised they were on a runaway, they would have very likely tried to bail out. After a bit of a conflab, they coupled up and very cautiously propelled the runaway back to the live section of electric rail in Liphook station, where most of the passengers detrained and went home, probably due to the fact that it was close on lunchtime. Ted, after the inquiry, informed Pat that he heard no more about the incident, a fact Pat found difficult to believe, but I suppose that so many rules had been broken or ignored that day, it would have been very difficult to word the charge sheet. Fog, Smog and Steam. For many years, London was known to country boys as the Smoke. It's difficult now to imagine how people got lost in their own localities due to landmarks being totally obscured by smog or dense fog. About 1958-59, Pat observed a bus conductor having to walk in front of his new Routemaster bus to alert his driver to park cars in Guildford's Upper High Street. This state of affairs could last for a number of days and nights on each occasion that fog and smog blanketed the countryside. Smog was a toxic yellow substance one could taste and continued to recur for nearly a decade after the Clean Air Act, which was introduced in 1956 as a consequence of the 1952 Great Smog. It took a few years to take effect. During subsequent years, the smog reduced gradually, but dense fog continued to make an appearance between October and March, well into the 1970s. At times, these very thick fogs descended over the countryside and were referred to as P-supers. In the 1950 issue of the British Railways Rulebook, there were about a dozen rules covering eventualities appertaining to operating staff working in such conditions. Clearly, train services were quickly thrown into confusion and disarray, causing severe delay, cancellation, derailments and the occasional serious accident. To try to assuage problems, the railways introduced M and E plans, morning and evening, in the early 60s, whereby the Southern published pre-planned cancellations, etc., which were issued to operating staff in busy areas. Obviously, as well as covering vast areas of the countryside, fog at times was very local, and as a consequence, signalmen were responsible for their own environs and had to decide when fogmen should be called out for duty. They usually had a visual marker, like a signal post, bridge or fence, which if shrouded in fog and couldn't be seen from the signal box, was the indication to call out the fogmen. A list of such men was held in reserve in each signal box and a station master's office, each being responsible for storing and issuing detonators. After collecting their issue of detonators, it was the duty of fogmen to walk to the predetermined signals for the purpose of placing detonators on the rail on the approach side of distant and stop signals as a warning to drivers. If the fogmen were lucky, there was a purpose-built shelter constructed of either precast concrete sections or wooden sleepers at each location with a brazier available for them to light for warmth. Guess where they got the coal from? If a fogman had just arrived at a signal and not had time to light his fire, a charitable engine crew, on coming to a stand at the signal, would give him a shovelful of red-hot coals, providing him with instant heat. Most signals were illuminated by oil lamps only, and not too bright on a foggy night. In such conditions, train driving was very difficult and a bit nerve-wracking, especially when one lost one's bearings. In those days, most stations were permanently manned, and station staff were called upon to place a hurricane lamp at the approach end of platforms for the drivers to spot a second or two before the station became evident. Some stations were lit by gas, others by electricity. Both emitted a poor but warm atmospheric glow, just discernible from close quarters in foggy conditions, conjuring up a vision similar to a scene from a Hammer horror film. Driving trains in such conditions was difficult to say the least. Even drivers with years of knowledge over their route could misinterpret their location. Locomotive drivers had up to 30 feet of engine in front of them. At times they could not even see the smoke box or chimney. There were occasions when locating a signal post where a fireman had to scale the gantry to check the signal. Retired driver Dennis Tack told Pat that he had to climb to the top of the signal gantry at Addleston Junction on one particular occasion, in a P-super, to determine if the semaphore signal was on or off. On finding a signal at danger, Rule 55 had to be carried out immediately, even when that section is track-circuited, indicated by a white diamond on a signal post. Mr. Bolland, Pat's inspector, emphasised at the firing school that during fog or falling snow, to the box you must go. Freight trains taxed locomotive crews to the extreme. Working such trains, mostly loose-fitted, demanded a thorough knowledge of the route. Pat's old driver, Ted Fry, used to say, "Always remember, old boy, what wants pulling wants stopping." In addition to the fog, to make things more exciting, some locomotives were so badly maintained they emitted steam from various apertures and leaking glands. As mentioned before, steam is an invisible elastic gas with great expansive properties, and only visible when exposed to the atmosphere. The colder the weather, the more steam you see. This could be a major problem when added to the fog, especially when undertaking shunting duties in yards and sidings. The loco crew, being unable to see the shunter's hand signals, had to accept commands by whistle codes. 1. Go ahead. 2. Set back. 3. Stop. 4. Ease couplings. 1, 2 and 4 were easy enough, because you were at a standstill when they were given, but 3 was obviously given when on the move, with the wagons and locomotive making a noise. At times, as in Aldershot Up Yard, the distance from the locomotive to the shunter's whistle could be a couple of 100 yards. Driving fast passenger trains generated its own problems. Endeavouring to spot signals at speed, a driver had to keep his head outside the cab, especially when his fireman was dealing with the fire. The glare reflecting from the forward-facing cab window made it impossible to see in fog. Cold or freezing fog made the eyes constantly stream, exacerbating an already difficult situation. Obviously, on seeing a distance signal at caution, the driver had to reduce his speed dramatically because he had already lost the seeing distance prior to reaching the signal, which in clear weather he would have benefited from. Stopping services had peculiarities that a driver had to bear in mind. Finding 80 stations in an 8-hour shift was especially tiring. Drivers had to listen for sounds when passing over or under bridges, and reverberations from buildings and points and crossings to establish their position. The fireman's assistance was essential to the driver, especially on a right-hand drive locomotive. It was necessary for the firehole door to be kept tightly shut when trying to locate signals, due to the glare from the fire reflecting on the fog. Most semaphore signals had their own individuality: upper or lower quadrant, high or low signal posts, sighted on gantries, upside or downside for sighting purposes, prior to or beyond overhead bridges, making them easier to identify. Colour light signals mounted atop a single post were all much the same, all cloned from a single parent. Another aid to drivers when installed were the AWS, automatic warning system, magnetic ramps, positioned in the forefoot. Even on non-AWS fitted locomotives and trains, if the fog allowed and the driver could see beyond the front buffer, spotting the ramps, which were usually positioned 200 yards prior to the signal, was a very helpful indicator as to how far away the signal was, and provided his speed was reduced early enough, the driver was able to bring his train to a dignified stop. This photograph shows an AWS Sunflower on a 1963 EMU VEP unit. This visual indicator was to remind the driver that they had received and cancelled an audible horn warning with a reference to the signal they were approaching, in this case a yellow caution signal. Should the signal have been a green aspect, an audible bell indication would have been received in the cab when passing over the track magnet, and the AWS display segments would have remained all black. By the early 1960s, most surviving steam locomotives were fitted with AWS, which was a great aid for locating signals. For older locomotives and some suburban units, they were never fitted. Picture the engine driver, if you will, staring into thick fog. He can't see any further than the smoke box, leaning out of his cab into the freezing slipstream of his locomotive, eyes streaming in the cold, his eyebrows and eyelids covered in frozen moisture, desperately seeking a semaphore signal protecting a busy junction, his 500 passengers calmly reading their evening newspapers, secure in the knowledge that their driver will deliver them safely to their destination. Ironically, most of the conditions quoted could be experienced by locomotive crews in a single 8-hour shift. In such diabolical circumstances, drivers face their responsibilities alone. Following several years' firing duties, Pat took his driving examinations. A fireman had to be at least 23 years of age before they could drive steam locomotives, and had no instruction at all. Everything for driving had to be learnt in one's own time and from experience gained. A driving exam consisted of a medical in advance, followed by the rules and locomotive knowledge, which were combined in a one-day exam. Then a one-day practical exam that consisted of, in Pat's case, about an hour and a half's driving. Pat's charge was the 10:54 a.m. semi-fast passenger train from Waterloo to Basingstoke, with original Battle of Britain class number 34064 Fighter Command for the outward trip, and a BR Standard Class 5 MT on the 1:13 p.m. stopping train from Basingstoke to Waterloo as far as Woking for the return. After arriving successfully at Basingstoke, Pat was instructed to have a drink and report on the up-through platform for the 1:13 p.m. stopping service to Woking. The examiner put Pat in charge of the Basingstoke driver and asked him to keep an eye on him, telling him, "Pat's all right, let him have a go to Woking. I'm going back into the train to check on the horses." Stepping off the engine at Woking, Pat's examiner alighted from the train and informed Pat that he had passed and could go back to depot and tell the list clerk that he was available for driving duties straight away and the paperwork would follow. Phew, what a relief. Obviously, in those days, Pat's firing experience was taken into account when he underwent his driver's exam. This photograph shows Pat passing through Aldershot at a later date, working a small train from Woking Yard to Farnham Tip with BR Standard Class 5 MT number 73037.